Super excited to be chatting to Rasheed Griffiths. Rasheed hosts his own podcast, The Rasheed Griffith Show. He leads the Caribbean Progress Studies Institute, and he also has roles as a Schmidt Fellow and Emergent Ventures Program Director. Rasheed, welcome.
Hello.
Thinking about the Caribbean, what do you think is most holding back progress? And on the other side, what are you most optimistic over?
Progress. So a lot of the reason why Caribbean has not progressed much since 1960s has to do with the quality of the public sector, where the quality of the public sector was actually a lot higher in 1960s, late 1950s than it is now. People find that very ironic. And because of that, the ability for the government to actually implement good, sound policies or programs, reorganize different priorities, has not tended to go very well in the terms of, for example, education, science policy, monetary policy. All of these things are going to go a lot more haywire as you go further into the independence period. So I think if the public sector of the Caribbean were able to be reformed in a way to allow for more competitive international workers, then you would get quite far in getting more progress in the Caribbean. It's not that hard.
And I guess that's a reason to be optimistic, is in the sense that if you can improve the public service part, then you could unleash quite a lot of progress. And I guess, is that the same reason for the stagnation for a lot of Caribbean? Is that it is mostly around the public services in your view?
Yeah, I think so. Because no, you could say things like, okay, there's not that much capital formation or things like that. But the problem is that you have a very direct path between very poor bureaucratic or very poor budgeted public sectors to having less capital formation. For example, if you have a hotel that wants to open in a Caribbean country, and it takes 5 years to get the paperwork done because of the bureaucracy, you already stall capital formation, you can stall everything else. So it really comes back to the public sector, in my view, especially for very small countries that don't have that broad view of coordination. Where in America, you have a lot more complex problems for England, for example. But for very small countries, to me, the problem is a lot more simple.
And so your idea that growth in the 1950s and 60s was better would probably stem from the fact that public services were better. And that correlates with post-colonial having a lot of that still infrastructure, which is essentially being imported from foreign talent. Is that primarily your view, or there are other nuances to consider?
That's a big part of it. Coming to the end of the colonial period, of the during the colonial period, a lot of the public sector technocracy was British influenced. At that time, then Britain had even itself a better public sector. So a lot of the British technocratic systems were used in the Caribbean, and that allowed things to be a lot more efficiently ran. But as we move away from that kind of technocratic nature of public service into essentially changing the public service into a jobs program, which was almost an explicit idea, for example, with the first Prime Minister of Barbados, Aaron Barrow, he had this idea that you can create a middle class via public sector engagement. And that somewhat definitely is true. By the same time, it lost the technocratic competitive nature of public service work. But therefore, the ability of people to properly implement policy just went down dramatically as you move into the independence period. So yeah, so the colonial administration of Britain at the time actually had a very big impact, positive impact on the public sector governance of the Caribbean and therefore growth. A lot of it was actually very British influenced.
And how much weight do you put essentially on the demographics of the Caribbean, in the sense that populations are quite small? So for a good technocratic institutions, perhaps ideally you'd want to import talent from anywhere in the world in order to help your own institutions out. And I've read that's one of the solutions that you're thinking about. Would that be one of the primary tools you would think about, or are there other things to consider as well?
Of course, there are other things to consider, but yes, having a technocratic public service is, I think, priority number one in terms of like deep reform, structural reform. And you do that by having a more international public service. This was, again, pretty common. For example, in Hong Kong, for example, pretty common. The area, for example, parallel. So right now, let's say Bermuda, the Caribbean country, but still a British dependency right now. They have a much more open public service. You have very many accents you hear in some policy calls in Bermuda, for example. You hear Kenyan accent, you hear Australian accent, you hear British accent, you hear Canadian accent. Where in Barbados, it really is just Barbadian accent you hear. And you can see numbers, Bermuda performs a lot better than Barbados in essentially everything you look at. So having an internationalized public service, which is antithetical to post-independent thought in the Caribbean, is something you have to get back to. Because as I said, they have a very small population. So Grenada has 100,000 people or so. You're not going to get enough high talented people to run the entire country from that very small pool of talent.
Do you like the idea of charter cities? And do you think it would be helpful in the Caribbean or it'd be better placed in other geographies?
I have a complicated thought on that. Essentially, I would usually, if someone have a good idea, wants to for some funding for EV, for example, and it has a charter city tinge, I probably would still give them money. I have done that before. However, in the Caribbean, I don't think it's actually necessary because, again, these are very small countries. The Caribbean countries themselves are charter cities. That's literally how they started. They weren't started by essentially conquest in most cases. There are people who had private interests and they wanted to go to this random new land and start building it up. That's what a charter city is. So the history of the Caribbean is essentially very charter city centric. However, to me, when you see that, that kind of gives you more pessimism towards charter cities because they slow down, they really don't really grow that much very long. And essentially, if you don't have outside influence, you really have a not a very good chance of it working. It's why I always find people always use the Hong Kong example. It's a terrible example because it was again outside influence. It was internally constructed from private enterprise. So I don't actually think there are any good examples of properly working charter cities as they're modernly in, let's say, conceptualized. I think in theory it can work. But for the Caribbean again, because these are so small, I think the effort you put into trying to build a charter city should be spent and put into reforming laws that already existed and getting better talent in the government, for example. Like it both are hard problems, but I think the my hard problem tends to has more utility.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because we have the same, I guess, issues in a lot of places between do you want to build a new institution or reform institutions that you have? Both kind of quite difficult challenges, but the
Yeah,
balance
but
of
a
weighting of that.
charter city isn't building a new institution. It's let's say making it to is a very simple thing. It's like building 1,000 new institutions.
Yeah.
It's all at the same time, and I don't think that's usually very feasible.
And where do you think dollarization helps or doesn't help? Would it help places in the Caribbean, or again, do you think it's for geographies and countries in a different circumstance?
So every Caribbean country should be dollarized, no exception. Caribbean countries, any small country, there is very little utility of having your own currency except for having the ability of the government to mismanage it at some point in time. And that has historically been the case in the Caribbean, been the case in Latin America, been the case in Europe, Asia, down the line. There's no real extra benefit you have from having your own currency as a very small country dependent on a global currency anyway. This manifests into even stranger things. So, for example, Caribbean still has very harsh capital controls. Not all Caribbean, but the ones that have their own currency do. And that limits people's freedom to consume as what they want. It also has, again, the ever present risk and reality of the government abusing the exchange, abusing the money creation tool, obviously hurting exchange rate, hurting inflation, all those kind of things. So when you really look into it, there's no proper counter argument to dollarization. To me, when someone says, what's the counter argument? And that's like saying, well, what is the argument in favor of having an unsound currency? It's a non-starter in that sense.
I guess the counter argument would have to rely on very reliable government, which is obviously not necessarily what we're looking at here.
No, but even then, the problem is that even if you rely on if you say we have a very good government, therefore let's have a national currency, there's still no extra benefit you get from doing that. Right? It's like having the currency is also stable if you have a very common government, but why put the effort into it? Right?
Sure.
Should Canada simply have its own currency tied to USD if it had a stable government? What's the benefit of doing that?
Yeah, I can see that argument. Actually, that leads me to think about the role of somewhere like China in the Caribbean or even Africa. How do you see Chinese influence, and do you see the sort of positives and negatives of that?
So China's influence has usually to do with economics. China has very little, if any, political influence on anything in the Caribbean. And in economics, it's still okay. So it depends on how you look at it. The correct way, in my view, is to see that if you go to any store in the Caribbean, you will see made in China. That's not unique to Caribbean, it's a very world phenomenon. Everything is made in China. But if you go, let's say, to your trade data, you wouldn't see a particularly large trade surplus or deficit with China. You would see it with the US still. So you assume, okay, therefore, the US is the most important trade partner to the Caribbean. But everything's still made in China. Because when you think about it, it gives a bad view when you look at trade numbers in this sense, because the goods go from China to the US, then it go from the US to the Caribbean. When Miami or New York or Pennsylvania or so on. It's Panama Canal, but different issue. So it seems like Caribbean, the major trade partner is the US, but clearly it's China because all the goods are made in China. So that kind of phantom trade issue you look at. So when you think about that more deeply, you realize that, okay, Chinese companies that exist for their own profit motives or other things. But what they did is that they pushed down the prices of most goods that you had to consume. So for Caribbean countries, very poorer countries, the benefit of China economically is the cost saving you get from your imports. And you can really deploy that money to other priorities. So just the existence of China in the global trading system is the biggest economic benefit that Caribbean countries get from China. It's not, for example, a loan for a stadium, a loan for a road, which are there are many of those things. But the macroeconomic benefit is just China existing as a global trading partner. People tend to not realize that's the real benefit. Now, China also puts like loans into Caribbean countries via like hotel loans, rural loans, bilateral loans, mostly infrastructure projects that are essentially more difficult to fund. The Caribbean countries find it hard to fund via normal processes. But I would say that it was difficult to fund via capital markets because the Caribbean governments themselves are very poorly fiscally coordinated. So they have a hard time getting money from the capital markets. So China has less due diligence, essentially. Not to say the bad thing, but they give the money a bit easier to Caribbean countries. So therefore, they like that. But I think that's generally not a good thing in how it's being done.
One interpretation of that is that Chinese institutions are prepared to accept below a market return, or in other words, they're taking on increased governance risk. Uh, in exchange for that, they are winning, in their view, um, political or social capital or influence. But your suggestion was that maybe these infrastructure projects aren't giving as much political influence as you might have thought. Obviously, important within the business communities who'd want those projects, and presumably, if they are taking risk that the other capital markets don't want, they probably are taking on higher risk.
It's not fully correct. So a lot of the loans that Chinese institutions give to, let's say, small countries, it's not from the explicit commercial process. It's from the state-owned enterprises. So when the SOEs get the loan, their portfolio of risk is a very higher tolerance because also they're more flush with cash. They have more liquidity to do those kind of things. But also, more importantly, the amount of money the Caribbean infrastructure project get from China is tiny in comparison to what they actually loan per year, even in China, for example. $200 million loan for a massive road project in the Caribbean is nothing compared to what they would spend, that similar institution would spend in China. So because of that, it comes from that same pool. It's not as difficult to loan the money. Relative now to, let's say you want to issue a bond from Barbados to to raise some money on the capital market to build the same roads, for example, the bond process is a lot more complicated, a lot more difficult fiscal policies have to put in place, and so on, because the origin of the capital is a different origin. It's not as, let's say, house or skelter, the give the money out, because it is from an SOE. If the Caribbean relied on commercial, let's say more explicit commercial loans from China, it would still be quite difficult to get money in many ways. Now, also, the again, I mentioned where Caribbean countries could raise any amount of money they want from the U.S. capital markets, but they're not organized enough to do it. So, a good example that you use is during the height of COVID, Bermuda issued a bond for $1 billion, and they got it filled quite quickly. And that same period of time, Barbados had to go to the IMF to get a loan because it couldn't actually get money from anywhere else. Same Caribbean countries, one has good fiscal coordination, one does not. Because you're so small, any amount of money you want, you can get from the market if you are properly organized. It's not a matter of the lack of money. The Caribbean governments often say, "Oh, there's lack of money for our priorities." It's not true.
Yeah, I could buy those arguments. To put that in the scale, China issuance in China, where you're talking hundreds of billions. So when you're looking at something which is essentially in the millions, you're talking about probably not even 1% of the kind of loans that are doing it. And even it sounds, oh, a country wants to raise 1 billion, that might be a significant amount. But in terms of debt issuance, again, it's so small, even in just the US capital markets, let alone when you go globally, that I can see it's probably more to do with process knowledge and governance knowledge and the stuff which is the bigger bottleneck rather than access to capital. So I'm interested then if you had, say, three policies that you would like to see enacted on the Caribbean, and I understand actually different nation states are a little bit different. What are the kind of policies that you would like? So I see one around dollarization, and I see one around the technocratic sphere, maybe getting more outside nationals. But there were any others policies you would like to add in terms of thinking about economic growth or political economy?
Public sector reform is a basket of policies, not one policy in that particular thing. But a lot of the policies will be revolved around making the bureaucracy less rigid and making it more conducive to capital formation. That is the real thing. But that's like a large blanket term for many small policies. For example, why does it take it so long for the countries to form a company? Why take 3 weeks? Why take 2 months? It's actually quite long in some Caribbean countries. Or for example, why can't they get access to good central banking data? All these smaller problems. Or for example, why do we think this is not policy per se, but it's just gets into the political economy after your question. Why do we think that the internal domestic economy is the more important aspect of growth? So that's a big issue. So the correct way to think about it is something like the nation is not the economy. And for small open economies, that is the fundamental truth you have to start with, where your economy benefits and can grow only when you act as a loser between global trade and global capital. You can't think of your dimensional geography as like the thing you have to optimize. That's not true. Optimize the louvering between your geography and outside geography. And very often in Caribbean, you don't have that mindset. You have that mindset of we have to do everything domestically, like food security, the domestic problem, things like that. Climate issues, the domestic problems, and so on. but you cannot have that mentality to start growth. You have to have the mentality of a Caribbean country is a global vehicle of growth. And until you have that mindset shift, a lot of these policies I'm talking about might actually seem abrasive. When you have that shift, you realize that, oh, of course, you have to do that way.
Yeah. So actually sitting right at the top is this kind of cultural or mindset shift change. Because we'll give a couple of your examples, the speed of business formation or the speed of a planning permit taking so long. Presumably some of that is it's sitting in front of a person who doesn't feel any urgency in pushing it
Yes,
on. Some of it was technology, because I'm assuming you could do some stuff more digitally via paper and there's an element of
yes.
it. But if you had more of this urgency, which would be in a better person or a person who had that kind of agency, which is either the cultural mindset or the type of person that they are, then those are things which would speed on. There's not a technical issue per se. In order to do that, you could have the people and the processes in place.
Talent. The talent of the public sector really is the limiting factor. I think always comes back to that idea. If you do not have a talented public sector, especially in a small economy, there is nothing you're going to get done that has any chance of working concretely over long term.
And do you see this adjacent to, say, cultural capital? I remember reading one of your essays around the Nobel Prize winners, which has come from the Caribbean. And I think there were four in history, but less so in recent decades. And I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about why that might be, and if it's a similar issue in terms of people capital, or is it just how the emphasis in terms of the cultural mindset of what the Caribbean wants to focus on in terms of its cultural arts?
So mindset is also a big part of it. I have a fairly, guess, negative view these days of Caribbean art, not in terms of the concept of it, but the process of it, where a lot of Caribbean art these days is really focused on, broadly speaking, decolonial theory. I don't feel how familiar with that broad category thing. And because of that, there's not much, in my view, there's not much you can do to have really inspired work when your mindset is very political. And because of that, I think art has taken a second place to activism in the Caribbean, more so than many places, because you have the issue in the Caribbean, let's say even in the US, England as well, that a lot of the young writers, essentially just people from Brooklyn that go to cafes and write about oppression, essentially. You have a similar thing in Caribbean, honestly. And slightly that was not the case in 1950s and 1960s. It was a lot more vibrant into the world creation. Right now, it's no longer about world creation. That's how Caribbean culture was. It's now about like oppressive narratives. As that shift, I think, is very toxic into the benefit of Caribbean culture. And you see it in music, you see it in writing, you see it in the actual art as well. So there's a lot of complex issues going on there that I think have been stalled that Caribbean culture. In terms of other kind of talent aspects, Caribbean is way more educated today than it was 50 years ago. Like no comparison. However, it does feel like the idea of the Caribbean has become weaker and weaker over time. Where even when you have people that go to London and Toronto and New York to study and live, they have a less strong connection to the Caribbean as they did before. And many reasons why I think that could be the case. But it definitely Caribbean culture has gotten a lot more weaker in the last 50 years.
And then thinking about some Caribbean writers, I'd be interested what you would maybe get from V.S. Nepal and what he would say today, and maybe whether you have a favorite Caribbean writer or artist you'd want to comment on.
Okay, VS Naipaul. So VS Naipaul is, especially in the Caribbean, also has a very like love-hate relationship with him. I would guess, this is my guess, on net. People who tend to teach literature these days in Caribbean on net have a negative view of Naipaul. I think even when I was in school, not that long ago. So we could have like 15 years ago. It was still, I think, fairly negative towards Nepal. Nepal. Now, what would he say? Nepal, I think, would be very deeply troubled by the state of the Caribbean
Yeah.
and the world, to be honest, especially the Anglosphere. He's very big on the Anglosphere. I think he would assume by now you have a lot more Anglosphere power, a lot more Anglosphere coherence, and this idea of post-coloniality would have essentially ended by now. At least how we see it as. Because his view is the only way for the Caribbean to really thrive was to embrace the cosmopolitan nature of the Anglosphere. That was the only possible way forward. But the current theory, especially in literature and even economics, for example, is you have to depart from the Anglosphere. England was all bad. It was nothing to gain, nothing to benefit. You have to go away from it. Australia, Canada, America, these are all bad places. These are oppressors. You have to go away from it. So it's completely opposite to what Naipaul's theory of social change is. So I think he'd be even more grumpier
Yeah, if
than
possible. I think he would. I think he'd be very grumpy. I think he'd be surprised in the woke movement, surprised but not post
yes.
woke, and where everything has happened. And then he'd be extremely grumpy about it. That'd be quite
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
Do you have a favorite Caribbean writer or artist that you like to either read or look at their work?
I do really like Nightfall. I think all his books are people have some things. Oh, some Hitler books are a bit not as good. I'm like, okay, sure, it's not as good. 190 is still pretty good to read. All his books are highly recommended, especially his Caribbean focus books, because he had the correct view of what post-colonial theory should look like. And often the Caribbean, again, I think post-colonial theory was a lot more creative. It was a world creation methodology, where now, I guess, it's a kind of destructive methodology these days. But early 80s reggae music from Jamaica is still, I think, one of the best the world has ever had, period. And but I think it's a bit harder to get into because it requires a lot more contextualization of what they're talking about, the terms they use. Uh, a lot of like terms like Babylon, for example, that you have to know the psycho spiritual nature of those terms and really get what these people are saying. So, 80s, 70s reggae is, I think, one of the best human creations you have. And unfortunately, not that many people actually can consume it because they don't get what's happening. There are some books that try to get you into 1970s and 80s reggae, but I feel when I read them, I feel they're just missing something. I I guess I guess I try to put a bit too much intellectual nature into the music, but it is very intellectual. But if you can listen to like the 80s and 70s reggae, like Peter Tosh, Gregory Isaacs, those people love Bob Marley. I think Bob Marley is actually not that good in my opinion. So if you could do that, then you could get very far to understand like Caribbean like cultural issues, which is a very complicated topic.
I think Tyler Cowen has one of his phrases that context that which is scarce. And I think for a lot of music, that's often the case.
Oh yeah, for
And
sure. That's true.
I recall in one of our previous chats, you made me understand much more clearly that reggae has a huge undercurrent, essentially, of violence. I get
Mm,
the popularity of Bob Marley makes you think that it's all about kind of love and hugs. And actually, a lot of he's got Rise Up. There is a lot of undercurrent of violence even within that. But actually, then when I went to go and listen to some more, it becomes very obvious of this. And that perhaps reflects some of what's happened in Caribbean culture. Do you still see that violence streak as much? And what's your explanation for where it's come from and where it's going?
Essentially, I see reggae now as being a lot more humble, which is not good. So it definitely used to be a lot more violent. But the reason why it was violent, and in some ways that's not a fair term, but it's still accurate. It was a lot more about revolution, about world creation. And oftentimes, especially when you're thinking about like Caribbean or the Black Power change in those time period, it was a very violent activity, and just for very general, obvious reasons. Now, because of this world creation aspect of reggae, the sentiment underlying everything was this way we have things now isn't good enough for ourselves. So the whole idea of Babylon is in Rastafari culture is this idea of essentially hell on earth. That's the kind of Christian version of this thing. Hell on earth is something we can actually move away from. It was actually the proper change, which is not a lot of time, for example, in woke theory, there is no road to Damascus in road theory. There is no salvation or repentance. Now, in Rastafari, you have the idea you can actually move away from Babylon to a better place. And oftentimes, sometimes that might require like violent activity, but not for the suffering one's sake. It's like something you have to go through really harsher mentality, harsher people to go to kind of salvation in that thing. So that's Rastafari culture. I believe reggae is really intertwined with Rastafari philosophy. So you can't really understand deep reggae artists if you don't understand Rastafari spirituality and philosophy. Now, because of this kind of world creation aspect of reggae, you have these themes like you need justice, you need more equal rights, you need essentially more political stability. Yes, of course, underlying many aspects of Rastafari was this idea you have to be anti-imperialist. However, the coherence of anti-imperial thought in Rastafari culture is not actually that solid. For example, if you speak to Rastafari communities in Cuba, they're actually very pro-capitalist because, in their view, the socialist, communist nature of their society is what creates Babylon. So it's very a meldable, is that word? A meldable concept in that sense. When you look at Rastafari culture in Japan, you have different dynamics also. But it's the idea that Babylon has to be broken down. And oftentimes it involves politics, it involves work creation, it involves justice, it involves education, it involves it's just like very techno optimist pro idea of reggae that people tend to not realize is there in the most of the music. That was where it stems from. These days, however, the influence of Rastafari culture has substantially diminished on reggae. When something internationalizes, of course, you're going to have the different cultures that we have. Japanese people doing reggae, you have American white people doing reggae, you have Asian people doing reggae, of course. In Jamaica, however, the many of the good artists, they left, went to England, they left, went to New York and many places because they realized because of globalization, you can actually make a good living in a different country. So when you actually drain out the very top talent of reggae from Jamaica, you're going to have, of course, a slowdown in the progress of the genre. So nowadays, to me, it's very self-reflective. It's not about recreation, it's about reggae. And when art gets to that point, you realize it doesn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a really interesting history of where we come from and where we're going. How important do you think food is to understanding the Caribbean or Caribbean culture? And we had a podcast with Fuchsia Dunlop, and there's a strong argument that you can understand a lot about China through it thinking about its food. Is that so important to the Caribbean? And also, how do you think I should choose food out there in the Caribbean? You have a great post on looking at food in Panama, but I'm interested in if the food culture overall is a very important way of trying to understand the Caribbean.
Yes, I think you can definitely learn a lot about Caribbean culture by food. Just requires some more work. To be fair, it's similar to China, but we think of China as a coherent place. We have like Chinese food, and there is no Chinese cuisine. There are different cuisines in the place we call China. Similar thing in the Caribbean. So, for example, Trinidadian food, so the country Trinidad and Tobago, is heavily influenced by Indian culture, Indian cuisine, because after slavery, after emancipation, a lot of Indian laborers were brought to the Caribbean, particularly in Guyana and Trinidad. And of course, that has a massive impact on society, right? Like, almost half and half now, I believe, in Trinidad is Indian and Afro. Just not fully half, but also it's Syrian and others Chinese also there as well. I grew up eating roti and curry goat, for example. And if you on the surface say that is a very strange thing to grow up in the Caribbean eating. But when you understand why you in Barbados eat curry goat and roti, of course that has a very big impact on how you think about your own history. Jerk chicken is very famous in Jamaica. I think it's very difficult to get good jerk chicken outside of Jamaica. There are some spots in London that have some good jerk chicken, but usually if you go to a place that has jerk chicken, it's likely not actually jerk chicken. Any case, even jerk chicken, for example, if you understand how it works, is very deeply intertwined how Jamaican history operates. They came from, let's say, African slaves, this plantation has these thing called maroon, like free slave holdings in the mountains in Jamaica. And jerk chicken is one of the food products they actually created. It goes very far back. And one of the current ingredients of jerk chicken that's usually used in sauce is soy sauce. Now, soy sauce, of course, is not from Jamaica, from China, primarily speaking. So you see how the Chinese influence in Jamaica, for example, goes back to the food. The core Jamaican food has this Chinese influence as well. Actually, even reggae, the studio that Bob Marley recorded in when he was younger was owned by a Chinese woman, actually. And that was the first really proper studio that really got him to be famous. And that became a very pivotal point in reggae history, owned by a Chinese family in Jamaica. When you peel back the thing, goes all the ingredients and so on, across the Caribbean, yeah, everything had context. If you understand why, it's almost like a very daunting task, but it's something with Fuchsia and China. If you can embrace the context or wanted to dig into the context, you can understand a lot of what societies find the foods they eat. That's true everywhere.
I didn't realize the connection between soy sauce and true jerk chicken. And that's actually a wonderful elliptical way of the fact that open economy trade, particularly for small
Mhm.
nations, is so important. Maybe turning to ideas on talent. Essentially, you assess talent through emergent ventures for the Caribbean, and generally, you're meeting talented people. What is it you look for? Are there any particular questions you're asking now at the moment, or qualities in responses that you look for in terms of assessing what high talented people might be?
Yeah, so I'm in charge of the program for emerging ventures for Africa and the Caribbean. And I do obviously a lot of very many interviews to assess talent. A lot of my questions are not gotcha questions. That's not like a very thing I do that often. I am very interested in how well you can talk about things that you don't directly work in, that kind of contextualization, that kind of cosmopolitan view of many things. I'm very curious with people their view on that. If you are, for example, working on some synthetic biology topic, of course we'll discuss that and get into it. But I'm also curious of how much art you think about, how much music you think about, how much social issues you think about. I'm not saying that will underweigh or overweigh something. I'm generally very interested in those kind of things. I think that people who have the ability to have this kind of multi-contextual awareness generally have the ability to also have their own main aspect to be very highly productive in that way as well. Of course, there are people who are very good at one thing that, of course, sometimes it's worth funding, but it's a different kind of person in general.
And would that say the majority of the time you're assessing the person over the project? Obviously, they're a little bit intertwined, but at this early stage, a talented person with ideas and wanting to go for it is probably more important than the actual project they're working on. Obviously, it can vary, but usually, I guess the projects are more high risk in their nature anyway, and it's assessing the person. Or do you think an assessment on a project is equally as important?
The project is often a reflection of the person. So you need to understand the person a bit better. Sometimes you can have a person that has a bad project idea. I think that's actually a bad reflection, to be clear. But if you have a good project and you have a good person, that's the correct combination. If you have a good person and a bad project, still bad. If you have a bad project and a good person, still bad. But the probably what brings you into the person. Because you don't see like a very long background when you see the application about people per se. You have the more project focused information. So you have to be able to reflect your goodness in your project. And that's what brings you into the conversation. So they're both of them are important. If we were to like push me, I'll say yes, the person is more important at that early stage, but a project can't be a bad project.
Yeah, I think I agree. If I meet someone and they often say, "Oh, should I submit or the things?" and I think they're a good person, but I think their project is bad, I say, "Wait until you have a better project. This doesn't really reflect your how great your thinking is." One thing I haven't been able to sway between the weight of is how well someone's written communication is versus their spoken communication. And strangely, actually, in a time of Zoom and everything, I do think in person is quite important. But I potentially uprated the ability to express ideas well on paper. And those who can't do that, I feel, are increasingly at a disadvantage, even though we have generative AI and things of that nature to help in certain ways. I think that clarity of thought is becoming more important to me. But I flip flopped on that. So I'm interested to know how important sort of the written communication piece is over the oral. Some people obviously are better in one or the other, or whether you want all of the above. As you've indicated, it's nice to have a good project and a good person.
It's necessary, not nice. So see, especially with EV, because our application is so short, that if you don't put a bit more effort into it, it reflects bad on you and the person in this conversation. So in our case, the written project, the written application is very important. But you have some that are like much longer, you have some that are very short, but something that you can convey the core idea in a much more shorter way. And once you can make it interesting, then fine. But I think if you cannot, clearly, if you cannot convince me that the project is worth thinking about on the application, there's no second step. So it's very important. But I think that if you, let's say the application isn't like perfect, again, like only 3 questions. You can't have a perfect application in 3 questions. It has to be good enough. And very often, good EV people, they have the ability to answer 3 questions. We don't put trick questions in the application. Very simple. Who are you? What are you doing? Why? And also there's the question about what the thing you agree with that everyone else agree with. Kind of conformity, non-conformity question. If you can't have a good written part for those questions, there's something wrong. So it is in our case because the application is not so long. You can think a lot about it. Whereas it does reflect how someone thinks for their own project and their own talent.
Yeah, I think that's really clear. Do you have a favorite kind of meta question at the moment? I guess Tyler still likes the what's on your browser tab at the moment, or he'll sometimes ask, how do you think this interview is going? I get the impression you're more interested in the exact person and project, so it's much more tailored to the person. But I don't know if you feel like there's a gap in the interview and it's not going super. Have you got one of those questions that you like to throw in and say, okay, let's try and open this up?
I would say in some ways I'm a bit lucky because our application is quite high quality
Mm.
in terms of the ones I speak with. Again, the original part already gets to a point where you can think, oh, you have a sense, by the way, by the original application, if you're already going to give the person money.
Yeah.
And it's usually that kind of thing. And the Zoom interaction is often a confirmatory conversation.
It's
There,
theirs
there,
to
there's
lose in the interview.
Yeah, exactly. There are a few times where there are a few times where the Zoom made me not want to give the grant, but those are more rare than not. So it's always a conversation that it's never too long in the first place. So there's no like lull that oftentimes. Now, sometimes I would tend to ask people like, "What's the last concert you've been to?" Or "What was the concert? Why this particular concert or this artist?" Something like. Sometimes if someone say, "Oh, I've never been to a concert," I was curious too. That's why, and that kind of goes to conversation. Do you like music and so on? And I do ask them like what they read oftentimes, and sometimes people it's you get some very surprising answers sometimes. Like remember I had an interview with someone and I asked for what's the last concert you went to. He said, "Oh, I actually went to one last week." It was this like very popular Ugandan folk singer, and that had a whole conversation itself going down the line. But I guess I don't tend to ask that many meta questions in that sense because I guess it depends on the stake at play, and how much really you're trying to ask this person about themselves. But oftentimes it's not necessary in my view.
Very, very clear. So, thinking about your own creative processes, do you have anything about your own writing process or reading or thinking process that you think is either unusual or not unusual? Do you have a routine? Do you like writing in the morning or the evening? Do you have a particular way of reading? Anything you like to share about your own creative or analytical processes?
I have no routine, which is a bad thing in many ways.
Routine
I
in
actually
itself, having no
I
routine.
guess I guess so. I tend to write at night, like very late, like 10 o'clock to 1 a.m., that time period. And there's no good reason for that that I can think of, but I tend to write a lot at that time of the day. And I somehow think it's because of just my time zone changes. I used to live in Asia, then live back in Eastern time, then live in Europe, then live back in Eastern time. And somehow it flipped in my head that that's the correct time to write. I consume a lot of information before I write usually anything. And sometimes I think I consume too much information because it makes it hard to actually get started. And I have this issue where somehow, some reason, I can't write anything unless I have a very good introduction already finished. I tend to say, "Oh, I can't write it." Like, "Oh, where's it gonna go?" But when I get the introduction, let's say in the way that I like it, then I essentially write the whole thing in 2 days afterwards. And that is I don't know why I do that, but I find that I've been doing that a lot, and it's been tending to converge on that particular method of writing. I do not like writing that much I often make notes shorthand. I always make my notes shorthand. I tend to not make that many notes on like a phone unless I'm like in a plane or something or a train. And I usually then read back the notes before I start writing. But I definitely don't have any tips that I've used for anyone else.
Yeah.
But my that's very chaotic. If I'm working on something, I have a desk like, full of books and pages and handwritten notes. I'm like, "Where's that note? Where's this note?" I don't know, and that's how I usually do it. I guess I have I'm trying to do like a theme of things I'm working on now, very Caribbean centric stuff that I think I'm really under theorized for sure, definitely under written about as well. And I'm trying to do that now. I have like a bunch of posts coming out about Caribbean post-colonial theory and so on. The next post I think I'm going to finish probably the next week is about it's a book review of The Case for Colonialism by Bruce Gilly. It's like a review of that book, but in a Caribbean context. And then a major project I want to do at some point before summer or in summer is like a four-part piece about the British West Indies Federation because it's a very pivotal point in Caribbean history. First, well, it lasted 4 years. I had a 10-year lead up, and you can't really find any good information online about it that isn't wrong. I've consumed a lot of YouTube videos and stuff that people have really no idea what to talk about. And luckily, I was able to go to London and go to some rare bookshop to find some rare bookshops to find some original books written by the people who were involved in federations from the British side also to really kind of piece together things. So like, how am I doing archival work for a blog post? But essentially, that's what it came to.
That sounds great. I don't think any other one person's writing process very rarely is helpful for another person's writing process, but I'm always fascinated because it's always different. Do you write to music or no music, or are you neutral?
Good question. So I write, I will say for the majority of time I write, it is to no music.
Yeah, I'm the same. I can't normally write to music. The one exception is when I'm writing things when I'm not quite sure what I'm writing. There is some classical music that I can listen to, particularly Bach's Goldberg variations, which I've listened to so much
Mm,
that it's there. But when I'm writing actual words for something, particularly in dialogue, and I have songs which
mm.
have other dialogue, I get lost, so I can't do that. I guess my
I
other
will
one on
say
the writing, go on.
I will say when I'm drafting things, like I say I'm like going through the first draft or something, when I'm drafting the first time, I tend to listen to music in that part of the
Mm,
writing part, but I tend to listen to a different kind of music. I don't know if Louis Andriessen work in Union's piece.
no.
If let's just look it up. It's a very bombastic, like wild noise. It's playing classical music.
Mm,
It's very bombastic, very wild. It's almost painful, depends how you think about it. But it's very good, very calming for my anxiety
really.
writing. Things like that I do listen to in the early stages, but then when it comes to a second draft or so on, it's dead silent.
Yeah. Okay. Definitely check that out. And do you edit as you go or edit at the end? It sounds like you edit at the end rather than edit as you go, except for maybe in your
Correct,
note phase. Yeah.
correct.
Great. Let's maybe, in honor of Tyler, do a small overrated, underrated section, and then we can
Sure.
talk about other current projects and any advice you have. Overrated, underrated, or you can make some comment. The resource curse, overrated. And that's because people use it too often to describe something where it's actually not as powerful a force as it might
That's
seem.
right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay, that seems fair. GDP as an economic measure, overrated or underrated?
Underrated. I think it's definitely underrated. I think it's quite clear. People tend to try to find all these superficial flaws with the methodology, with the conceptualization of what constitutes GDP and so on. But it is a tool that has utility and it still works well for that thing, which is it actually does correlate the things that you want to happen. So yes, it might not be a perfect conceptual tool, and that's fine. I think the problem is that people, economists or non-economists, I probably should say, have this idea that, oh, well, if you say these are GDP, therefore that means it's important. That means it. No, it's a tool to understand the world. It's not supposed to be the world. But many political scientists and people like that want it to be the idea that this is the thing that needs to be reflecting on how our values the world should be. No, it's a tool. So as a tool, it works perfectly well.
Yeah, underrated by non-economists. I can see that, and I'm always surprised when I look at some of the other metrics much I might be interested in, say life expectancy or education or even some of these happiness measures. And the correlation of GDP is so high. It's actually I could have used GDP and I would broadly have got
Yeah,
a lot of
exactly.
those measures. It's
You
kind of
do a
really interesting.
social progress index, all these kind of things. So yeah, okay, fine. GDP still works equally as well.
Very good. Okay. Overrated, underrated, the idea of universal basic income, UBI.
The first ever paper I wrote was actually about UBI. It was with a professor at college back in like say 2013. Overrated. It's very overrated. Which is, if you ask me 10 years ago, I would say underrated, but now I think it's overrated because the benefits you get from UBI are not actually very pronounced. And the thing you want to optimize the BI, you can do via other methods. And very often time, people who are super supportive of UBI do so for very theoretically weak reasons. And people who are very anti-UBI, they tend to do it for political reasons. But I think for basic macro policy reasons, you just don't need UBI. And I am speaking about this from a small country perspective in particular. I don't think it's necessary. It's definitely not necessary. And I would go as far as say it's actually not even useful for small countries.
Interesting. I'm really interested in people who've changed their minds over that. Yeah, at the margin, I would definitely go for infrastructure, essentially public goods, good public goods and services. But that might be intangible infrastructure over the actual UBI
Well,
as well, I think.
it's not. I'm
But
not. For example, in small countries, welfare reform is still very needed
mm,
and it's still very important. But the problem is that when people often talk about UBI, they want to not put in the work to do reform for the welfare state to make it actually very useful for people. Like,
yeah,
let's just get rid of that. Do UBI, we're done. The problem is that just too wasteful, it's too practical. Again, for small countries in particular, you do need a good welfare reform, but UBI isn't the way to do it.
yeah. I've heard actually, I think Tyler Cowen suggests that essentially the US form of kind of disability benefit, I don't know what they call it, is a pseudo UBI with a bureaucracy hurdle to get it. Because once you get it, and it's often given to you in the community, it's very hard to come off it. So it acts as a kind of pseudo UBI stabilizer, but you wouldn't want to ever make it an explicit UBI policy for all of these other reasons that you've alluded to. Great. Okay. Last couple, overrated, underrated, carbon tax.
It's underrated. Sorry,
Well,
overrated.
overrated.
My goodness, my goodness. It's overrated. It can't.
For political economy reasons or like standard macroeconomic reasons?
So okay, I would say in general, I personally don't think that a carbon tax has any real life utility to it. It's just a way to absolve yourself using capital markets about this like conceptual pollution concepts. And people who are going to pollute for whatever reason are going to do it. I don't think you can use capital market. This is a very clear example of using capital market for absolution or the attempt of absolution. There's all these ESG type things. It doesn't really add anything really to me to the utility of a market. It just gives you that symbolism of doing something. So for that's the main reason why I think it's overrated. Is it's no who actually benefits from a carbon tax, I guess the underwriters, but it's not actually useful. I think capital markets truly can be useful.
Yeah, that's clear. I think it's easier to see in something where air pollution, where I think this is the case where actually direct regulation of the air pollution itself is going to be easier because a capital market fix for something like air quality is going to be super hard. And like you say, it's not maybe the primary function of a market or a capital market in that sense.
But we have many examples of air quality improvement long before carbon credit became a thing. So
Exactly. Okay, and last one, overrated, underrated, big technology, big tech.
always underrated.
And so that would make big technology regulation overrated then as well.
I guess in general, I don't think I can think of any particular examples of big tech regulation that I can see as productive. Yeah, I can't think of any. So yes, so definitely less of that. Yeah, always overrated. It's one of the things where we think about the Caribbean, just to have the Caribbean thing. One of the most important things for the Caribbean is the American airline industry. And a lot of times, people don't think of that. They think of tourism, but tourism, you have to get people to the Caribbean. So the airline market in the US is probably the most transformative thing for Caribbean history in many ways. And if, for example, the airline market in the US was actually way more regulated as it was before, Caribbean tourism would not be a thing. But Caribbean people don't realize these things are true. So they say, yes, you need more regulation on everything and so on. Where their entire resistance is because they deregulated the airline system in the US in particular. So essentially, yes, usually regulations for big companies are, I would say, they're not even always well intended. They're sometimes well intended, but oftentimes they don't really become productive.
Very fair. Okay, last couple of questions then. So one is, do you have any current projects or future thoughts that you'd like to share? You talked about a couple of blog posts and readings that you're going to do, but any other large projects or ideas in the future for you?
I have this new think tank, so that's essentially a large project. Is a meta project. So a lot of things I think that I want to do a lot more of, and there are some themes. For example, I want to do a lot more, not only me, but want to influence people to do a lot more of, is Caribbean economic history, because there is there are two good books about Caribbean economic history, two good books about Caribbean economic history, both written by a British professor who's now retired, Victor Thomas, who I met him 2 times in London. Very insane guy. And he's very old now. And there are no people really working on this kind of topic. And I obviously have a personal interest in Caribbean econ history, but I think as an academic subject, it's also quite good to study, because in the Caribbean, you have at least 4 different empires interacting at the same time. And you have a cultural, let's say, a cultural market that's very similar in many ways. So it's one of the few places where you can hold culture as a constant and actually contextualize many other variables in economics from very different origin points, and actually see the different outcomes in the contextual. Very vibrant place for economic history research, but it's not actually a thing anymore. So let's fund a lot more of that, kind of find some ways to find the people to do those kind of research and fund it and create a community around that particular academic um, discipline. That's a big kind of long-term project. I also want to do a lot more of colonial theory, where I think we've got to a point. Is this line of all history is revisionist history, because at any point in time, sometimes you step back with fresh eyes, with new values, and take a look again at the past. And we've got to a point where post-colonial theory has been so dominant in our zeitgeist, in our academia, and so on, and we forget that the second half of the colonial period was a very entrepreneurial, very progressive, very productive time, especially for young countries. And if you don't understand what they did and how they did it and try to replicate it, you're not going to get anywhere into the progress. End of British imperialism was a very bad thing for Caribbean progress. So I want to resurrect that idea again, push for some more British imperial theory in the Caribbean context as well. Again, this is history, more history projects in some ways, but that's the kind of thing I want to push and fund in the very near future.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. I guess I don't have a super deep knowledge or experience of that, but I can see that it's very cluttered with a kind of politics or political economy thing. The only time I ever really got super in trouble in Twitter was for suggesting only very loosely on other factors around Ireland when it was coming post-industrial revolution that weren't connected to colonialism. Because actually, if you look at a lot of papers on the economic history, there's a lot of other factors within industrialization which weren't necessarily to blame. And then if you look at the economic historian debates over the role of slavery, again, very hard to get to the actual data on it. But again, it does seem that some of the politics around it are not necessarily supported by some of the data when people have reconstructed it back. But it's quite hard to get to close to the truth. The data isn't super great as well, and it has this whole layer of other politics around it, which makes it quite difficult, I think, for mainstream academics to tackle that.
Yeah, that's true. I guess another big project activity I'm going to be doing in the foreseeable future is anti-reparation debates. So Caribbean governments total, the independent ones, are very pro reparations from the UK. It's like bedrock policy in the Caribbean. It's not debate, essentially. And they've been pushing it a lot in the UK. Even a few months ago, the Prime Minister of Barbados gave a speech at LSE pro reparations. University of Glasgow has a reparations center. It's really heating up as a political movement. And a lot of what I am going to be writing, but mostly talking about in the next like year at least, is anti-reparations, because it is a parasitic topic for the Caribbean. It really perverts any kind of real government policy conversation, and it allows governments in the Caribbean to involve themselves and put in the actual work they need to do to strategize progress in the region. So even like later this year, I'm going to be in England at an event about reparations, for example. So it's a thing that I'm going to be very big into, because it's got to a point where facts are no longer required for argument. That's where it got to a point now in the Caribbean, and I guess in the UK too, because it's two sides of the tango essentially. So that's a big project as well.
Yeah, this is where it seems counterintuitive, but where you put the blame in the wrong places and the lodestone of the past weighs on you too much, it actually is then is a hurdle to progress and solving your future, which is quite a complicated thing. Okay, so the last question on that would be, do you have any life advice or career advice, or maybe advice for people who are about to do interviews? Any thoughts on advice you'd like to give the listeners?
Advice. I don't know. I don't know actually. I would say, generally speaking, that I think people should try to be a lot more public in their thoughts. Writing things online for the public is a nice constrained device. And some people it forces you to try to be more concrete. Granted, to be a lot online, that's bullshit, but so be it. But it really pushes you to be a bit more concrete in your writing and your thinking, more importantly, and it gives you a bit more confidence. So I'm very pro online activity. It'll be impossible to be where I am right now. Come from a small, tiny rock in the ocean to things I've done without the internet. To me, it's always underrated at all points in time completely. And I think people should actually engage with it more. Don't just lurk on Twitter, actually put things out, write things, do videos, do blogs, whatever it is. Just put more content there. If you actually want to, if you have an idea you want to change, what you want to share, do actually share it. Don't keep it inside your head for that often. That's what I tell people all the time. Pilot interviews, I think, generally speaking, it's not really advice per se, kind of obviously hard to do. Look, try to be more confident in an interview. It is a little good when people are so timid, unfortunately. That's the thing. You have to practice. Some people have it naturally. That's fine. I've done some interviews, people are like very vibrant and so on. So it's a different personality issue. But do try to be more confident. I think if you're not confident, pretend to be confident. I think that goes a long way
Yeah.
as well.
What's the phrase for that? Fake it until you make it. But yeah, I think practice for sure. And I think that helps them. I guess a lot of people talk about a work in public. And I had Hannah Ritchie on the podcast not too long ago, who's written a book on sustainability. And she wouldn't have got where she was today either without essentially blogging or others. Some people do it by video and the like. And it's a good discipline, like you say, to get your thoughts out there. And it's a good piece of social proof for other people to say, look, you're building something. And yes, we might have had mistaken ideas in the past. Don't worry about that. We will all do, and we'll have to change our mind. But you went to the effort of articulating that. So I think that's a very good thing. On that note, Rasheed, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.